next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And always glad to have on with us Alfred University Professor of History, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Hey, it's a pleasure to talk to you on this spring. I guess we call it a spring day. It was 22 degrees in Alfred when I got up, so I guess we have to be a little bit loose about our language here.
Well, Dr. Ostrower, you wanted to start out commenting on one of my comments.
Well, yeah, I was listening to the program on Friday, this past Friday, and you were interviewing Dr. Bob Heineman, and Dr. Heineman was essentially arguing that, look, this whole issue of the investigation is now over. It's past tense. We got to move on and whatnot. He's kind of beating up a little bit on the liberals who are, not letting it go. And then you had made the comment that, there are a lot of Trump critics out there who are just going to remain Trump critics. They are the Trump critics because, and I think this is your word, they're habitual about it. It's just a habit. But I don't think it's just a habit. I think that, the fact of the matter is that President Trump is the most controversial president that we have had, I would say, arguing, perhaps since, before the Civil War. And I do think that, there's a lot of stuff, particularly in respect to Mr. Mueller's investigation, that we still have to learn. And we have to learn it because the report has not yet been released. All we have gotten is William Barr. He's the Attorney General, an Attorney General appointed by Mr. Trump. All we have is his summary of that report. So, it remains to be seen, I think, as to whether or not the report is going to, quote, exonerate the president in the way that the president claims that the report exonerated him. Even Mr. Barr said in his very short, 3.5-page summary that while it does not, that is the report, the investigation, does not conclude that the president obstructed justice, he went out of his way, Mr. Barr went out of his way to say that it does not clear him of obstruction either. And that's a rather remarkable statement for an Attorney General to make, especially an Attorney General who was appointed by the president, and I think with the expectation that the Attorney General would help to exonerate the president. So, no, Mr. Trump is not exonerated. And even on the issue of collusion, it's a kind of an interesting thing. I think there's no question, absolutely no question, that the report is going to conclude that what the president did in the area of contact with the Russians is not indictable. There's not a crime there. And in that sense, I think the report is going to take off this issue from, it's just going to take the whole subject of impeachment off the table. Probably has already done that. But, the president has attacked one of the Democratic congressmen, namely Adam Schiff, calling him Mr. Pencilhead and so forth. And Adam Schiff responded to the president, responded to some of the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee in the House who had called for, 9 of them had called for his resignation because he has been such a critic of the president. And Adam Schiff's response was kind of interesting. He said, look, it's not okay that the Russians offered dirt on Hillary Clinton. It's not okay that members of the president's own family, both the president's son as well as his son-in-law, had indicated that, they would love to see this information. That it's not okay that the president invited Russians to hack into Hillary Clinton's email server and so forth. In other words, there's a lot of stuff going on that may not rise to the level of a crime. It may not be technically criminal to say these sorts of things, but to think that there isn't some kind of, really very unethical connection between a number of Trump's family, a number of his high-level advisors, including Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. There's something doesn't smell right in all of this. The president himself said, for instance, look, I have no business dealings with the Russians whatsoever. He said that during the campaign in 2016, and yet we now know that there were business dealings. He was already negotiating, deeply involved in negotiating, to build a Trump Tower, a Trump Hotel in Moscow. Rudy Giuliani, who's the president's personal attorney, said that, there was no collusion. And then he said something else. Well, maybe there is collusion, he said, but collusion is not a crime. And I would agree with that. Collusion is not a crime. But to think that there wasn't collusion, to automatically assume that there wasn't collusion, is not, I think, justified by the little bit that we know about the report. And so, we're left with, let's wait until the report comes out. It's a 380-page report. My hunch is that there's going to be plenty in that report that the president is not going to wish was made public, but until we see it, we're not going to know for sure. So let's not automatically assume that the critics are just, quote, habitually anti-Trump. They may have good reason to be, quote, anti-Trump, and I think that, historians are going to have the last say about this.
Now, Adam Schiff has a tweet out. It says Congress has asked for the entire Mueller report and underlying evidence by April 2nd. Do you think Barr will deliver by today?
I think the answer is definitely he will not. First of all, he's already said that there are going to be sections of the report that will not be made public, and we don't know what those sections are. I think it's very proper that he not make public those sections of the report that involve comment in grand jury proceedings. There may be some personal information, regarding witnesses and so forth that should be, not made public. But if we have to err, let's err on the side of transparency. Let's not err on the side of making as much of this material public. The president has said that he was, willing to have the entire report made public. Now he's backing away from that. He changes his mind every other day, so, one shouldn't be too surprised. But I do think that the public has a right to know. This is a 2-year investigation. It's a very, very important investigation. It goes to the heart of issues of legality, within the context of the presidential office. And I think, we should see that report.
Now, it doesn't seem that you're on the same page as Schiff on this one, Gary, because it says, and I'm reading from Congressman Adam Schiff's tweet here, Barr should seek court approval to allow the release of grand jury material. Redactions are unacceptable. What do you make of that statement?
Well, I'm not sure what to make out of it. I don't think he will get court approval. If Barr does seek court approval to make even those grand jury sections public, I doubt very much whether he would get it. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we shouldn't see that. I mean, here again, these issues go to the heart of what it means to be a democratic republic. They go to the heart of what we're talking about when we use, abstract phrases like the quote, the rule of law. And I think that, we have plenty of reason to think that the president has been fearful about what the report would uncover. The president attacked Robert Mueller during the investigation. He has tried to discredit the report. He's tried to discredit Mueller. So the question that one asks is, what does he have to hide? And there's a ancillary question I suppose we should all ask. Why was not the president himself willing to submit to an interview by Robert Mueller? He's never did that. What he did is he offered written responses to questions, which of course can be, manipulated in ways that would, hide some of the, important information that should have become public, that eventually should become public. And so, look, I guess what I'm saying is that there's good reason to think that we're going to hear a good deal more about this report. We're going to hear a good deal more about the investigation, and we may hear a lot more about the issue of obstruction of justice. Let's not automatically assume, in other words, that the report clears the president until we have a chance to read that report.
Security clearances being overruled by the Trump administration. What do you make of that?
Well, a woman by the name of Nebold, who has worked in the security office of the White House, both during the Obama administration and during the Trump administration, has said that there were 25 people for whom there were serious questions raised about security clearance. They didn't get security clearance until they were overridden by the administration. Overridden, in other words, for political reasons, one would think, by the administration itself. Now, I'm not an expert in security law, But I do know that there is nothing like this in American history. Every so often, there have been questions raised about security clearances for individuals who have been, who have applied for it. Sometimes it has to do with alcoholism. Sometimes it has to do with, something else. But nothing like we've seen here. And this even includes security clearances for Jared Kushner, who's the president's son-in-law, and for Ivanka Trump. It includes John Bolton. There are issues of conflict of interest. There are all kinds of things going on here. And most of this has been ignored, not only ignored, but essentially overridden for political reasons by the White House. I think it's important for, among other reasons, that foreign governments will be reluctant to share with the United States information about some very, very sensitive subjects, including terrorism. In the past, they have indeed shared this with our government, and I think under the circumstances, they're not going to do that in the past. And to that extent, I think this whole issue is going to damage our national security. So, what does it suggest? I think it suggests mismanagement in the White House. It suggests a kind of cavalier attitude toward American security. It suggests that political considerations are overriding security considerations. None of this speaks very well of the White House. And let's not complain about critics of President Trump. Let's complain about the way in which issues like security are being handled in the White House.
Talking to Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're going to take a quick break, check the forecast, and we'll come back and talk about this day in history. We'll also get in a little about the accusations against former Vice President Joe Biden. Stay with us.
Are you more than $10,000 in debt? Feel like you're on a never-ending treadmill, staying in one place and never getting ahead with those minimum payments? You feel like there's no way out? Don't let the credit card companies bully you anymore. There are programs in place to help you get free of your debt, and you don't have to pay the entire amount you owe. The program at Total Financial Freedom can help you get debt-free in months instead of decades. Get off the debt treadmill and stop the harassment. Get free of credit card debt, signature loans, department store cards, internet loans, and medical bills. Call now at 866-844-7344 for free information. For about 10 years, Total Financial Freedom has helped thousands. They're A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau, too. Get off the endless cycle without having to declare bankruptcy. You'll have the right to settle your debt for a mere fraction of what you owe. Call Total Financial now at 866-844-7344. That's 866-844-7344.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carroll, and let's see if the meteorologist has cooled down after yesterday's budget news.
Well, life cooled down, and so have the temperatures, Brian. Another chilly start across the southern tier this morning. A lot of us starting out in the 20s. The reason we're not quite as cold as we were yesterday morning, had a little bit of high cloudiness come in overnight. That prevented temperatures from falling as far. Looks like we'll have partial sun through these high clouds today. Temperatures, they'll warm up to a seasonal high of about 45 to 50 later this afternoon. Sunrise was at 6:50 this morning. It'll set tonight at 7:37. Now, looks like we're going to stay partly cloudy tonight. A lot of high cloudiness due to a decaying weather system to our west. One off to our south and east, passing off the coast. Lows tonight near 30. As that system goes by tomorrow, it's going to do two things. Pulls the high cloudiness out, so we're mostly sunny, we're breezy, and we're milder. It's going to help pull some warmer weather in from the west. 50 to 55 tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow night, partly cloudy, 25 to 30. We're going to cloud up on Thursday, 45. It looks like a storm coming in from the west may bring us a little bit of rain, either Thursday night or for Friday, Brian.
Well, meteorologist Rob Carroll, and if you didn't hear it yesterday, Gary Ostrower, Rob Carroll was a little annoyed talking about the part of the budget that had congested pricing, and I guess they're going to be taxing drivers in New York City on certain streets. Did you hear about that, Dr. Ostrower?
Yeah, I have heard about that, and I think that, if I'm not mistaken, they're supposed to use the tax revenues from these tolls for the upkeep of the subway system, of the mass transit system generally in New York City, and that's probably a good thing. Should we be driving our cars in New York? Well, some of us may have to, in which case, presumably, we're going to have to pay those tolls. But I think the other interesting thing that the governor is doing, from my perspective, is he is going to sign a bill that was, proposed by the Democrats I think initially in the Assembly and then in the Senate, to prohibit the use of plastic bags at supermarkets. So you'll be able to use plastic bags for some things, some pharmaceuticals that you receive and so forth. But the plastic bags that we get from, Wegmans and that we get from other supermarkets, those are going to be, I believe, as of March, they're going to be gone. So we're going to have to go back to paper. We're going to have to go back to, what do you call it? Those bags that do not clog up the environment in the way that the plastic bags do. I think that we're learning now that, plastic, not just plastic bags, but plastic bottles for water and so forth, there are miles and miles and miles of square miles of the Pacific Ocean right now, and maybe true in the Atlantic for all I know, that are just congested with all of this material. And we have no way of dealing with that. There's nothing that we can do about it. We can't really recycle it. Our environment is at risk, and we haven't taken that seriously enough.
Do you get a sense that the environmentalists would like to ban garbage bags as well, or do you think they'll stop at the grocery store plastic bags?
They have stopped at the grocery store. They're specifically not banning the garbage bags.
Do you think they'd like to in the future, or do you think they'll stop there?
I don't know. I suspect that some of them would like to ban almost all plastic, but most of the environmentalists are pretty. They're pretty sensible, and partly because they take advantage to a certain extent of the use of things like garbage bags. So I'm guessing that you always have extremists in a movement, like you do, for instance, in the PETA, the ethical treatment of animals or whatnot. But most people are fairly commonsensical, and I think we have to rely on the common sense of Americans to understand, number one, that we do have an environmental crisis, that we should not be eliminating the EPA, that we should not be defunding the EPA. I think the EPA has done a great deal of good for this country ever since it was founded in the early 1970s. The Clean Water Act, I think, has clearly made a difference. The Clean Air Act has made a difference. And if the Trump administration succeeds, or if the courts succeed in declaring these things unconstitutional, we're going to go back to a more hazardous environment, and I predict that the increase in our life expectancy is going to kind of flatten out.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, before we get to this day in history, did you have any thoughts on the accusations against former Vice President Joe Biden? Biden is saying that some of these photos are doctored. What do you make of that?
Well, I have no idea whether they're doctored or not. I really don't. I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know. But I do think that things have changed. That is to say, standards have changed. And what was perfectly acceptable 30 years ago or 20 years ago is no longer perfectly acceptable. And that's where I think Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden, may be, politically injured. In other words, he comes off looking as if he represents the past rather than the future. On the other hand, I think it's important to say that what Vice President is accused of doing, having rubbed someone's shoulders, having kissed someone's hair, okay, this is not sexual assault. Let's understand that there's a huge, huge difference between, say, what President Trump was accused by 19 women, okay, of sexual assault, and what Biden has done. Biden has been very, very supportive in many, many ways of women's rights, of women's equality, of equal, pay for women and so forth. And so we shouldn't get carried away by this. By the same token, what he did, and many, many, many others did, routinely years ago, that's no longer acceptable. And I think that all of us are going to have to be, all of us men at least, are going to have to be somewhat careful about the way in which we approach females in the future.
Dr. Ostrower, on this day in history, there's a few things, and I'll throw some out to you and let you pick the topic you'd like. Let's see. On this day, John Paul II died. Let's see, on this day in 1941, General Rommel recaptures Libya. And 1975, this day in history, April 2nd, 1975, South Vietnamese evacuation begins. Which would you like to do?
Well, let me say something, if I may, about General Rommel and Libya. General Rommel was essentially an armored, a tank commander for the Germans back during the Second World War. There were two men, one by the name of Guderian, and of course Rommel, who simply kind of revolutionized the way in which wars would be fought. The First World War was a static war. By static, I mean you had two sides that were dug into their trenches, and if you took, if one side, advanced even, 30 feet, 100 feet, 200 yards in a single day, that was a lot. What Guderian and what Rommel did during World War II was to institute the strategy of the so-called blitzkrieg. The blitzkrieg meaning, in other words, a lightning war, in which tanks, no longer, ground troops dug into trenches, but tanks would pursue the enemy over, sometimes 4 or 5 miles in a single day. And Rommel was very, very successful to do that in northern Africa until November of 1942. And in November of 1942, in a sense, the British caught up with him. And they did so at a place called the Battle of El Alamein. It stunned the Germans. It was the first major land victory by the British during the Second World War, and it completely changed the character of the war in the in northern Africa, because among other things it meant that Egypt would be safe for the British, and that meant travel through the Suez Canal would be safe for the British. So it was a very, very important turning point. On the other hand, we shouldn't get too carried away by the British victory. If I'm not mistaken, the Germans had 3 armored divisions in Egypt at the time of the Battle of El Alamein. At the time that they had 3 divisions in Egypt, they had about 160 divisions fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. And that's where the real turning point of the war was going to be, with, of course, the Battle of Stalingrad that begins in September of 1942 and doesn't end until February of 1943. And when the Germans lost that Battle of Stalingrad, they effectively lost the war. The Russians began to move to the west, and they wouldn't stop until they had occupied Berlin in 1945.
With that, we have to leave it. Dr. Ostrower, as always, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.